The autumn rain fell heavy over Manhattan that evening, casting the Upper East Side in shades of silver and shadow. But the story wasn't beginning on these rain-soaked streets. It was beginning in a memory that refused to die. Gianna De Rossi stood before her apartment mirror, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened the clasp of a midnight blue gown. The fabric clung to her like a second skin, elegant and austere, each seam a whisper of the life she once knew. 28 years old, yet she carried the weight of someone much older, the weight of a name that had been systematically erased from the world she was born into. Her father, Giuseppe De Rossi, had been more than a businessman. He had been a legend in Rome's highest circles, a man whose word was law, whose table was sought after by presidents and princes. But that was before the accusations, before the betrayal from those closest to him, before everything crumbled in a single night, leaving nothing but ruins and silence. The De Rossi name, once synonymous with power and prestige, became synonymous with shame. Guest lists were revised. Phone calls went unanswered. Former friends crossed streets to avoid encounters. Gianna's mother had withered under the weight of it all, dying not from illness, but from the slow poison of public humiliation. Her father followed 3 years later, his heart finally surrendering to a grief that no doctor could cure. Gianna had fled to New York to escape the suffocating weight of Rome's judgment. She built a quiet life, anonymous, unremarkable, safe. She worked as an art consultant, moving through galleries and private collections, always in the background, never drawing attention. Her apartment was modest. Her wardrobe was understated. She had learned the art of invisibility. But invisibility was a prison, and tonight she was breaking free. The invitation had arrived 2 weeks ago, delivered by courier to her office. It was elegant, understated, exactly the kind of invitation that carried real weight. A gala in Manhattan, hosted by Vittorio Morelli, the man everyone whispered about but few dared to name directly. He was the kind of figure that existed in the spaces between legality and shadow, powerful enough that legitimate businessmen courted his favor, dangerous enough that politicians paid him courtesy calls. Gianna had done her research. Vittorio Morelli's empire touched everything. Legitimate businesses that gleamed on the surface, darker operations that hummed beneath like an engine. He was 34 years old, never married, rarely photographed and spoken of with a mixture of fear and fascination that bordered on reverence. But it wasn't Vittorio Morelli who had drawn her to accept the invitation. It was someone else entirely, someone whose name appeared in the guest list commentary mentioned almost in passing. A man named Carlo Benedetti, who had been her father's closest associate before the fall. Carlo Benedetti, who had testified against him. Carlo Benedetti, who had walked away untouched while her father's world burned. Gianna had spent 6 months orchestrating this moment. She had cultivated connections, whispered in the right ears, positioned herself at exactly the right intersection of visibility and mystery. She had become the woman who knew things about art, about collections, about the hidden treasures that men of power coveted. And through those whispers, she had finally earned an invitation to a room where Carlo Benedetti would be present. She wasn't coming for revenge. That word was too simple, too crude. She was coming for something harder to name, for answers perhaps, or for the chance to look into the eyes of the man who had destroyed her family and see if there was any trace of conscience left in him. She was coming for closure, for the chance to reclaim some fragment of the dignity that had been stolen from her. The woman who looked back at her from the mirror was both familiar and foreign. The midnight blue gown hugged her frame perfectly, its neckline modest but striking, its fabric catching the light like water. Her dark hair, inherited from her Italian mother, was swept into an elegant updo. Her makeup was flawless, not obvious but deeply considered. She had spent hours perfecting the appearance of effortless grace. She looked like someone who belonged in rooms like the one she was about to enter. She looked like power wrapped in elegance. She looked like a De Rossi. The rain continued to fall as her car pulled up to the building in Tribeca. The gala was being held in a penthouse that occupied the entire top floor, a space that existed above the city. Separate from it, a kingdom unto itself. Security was subtle but omnipresent. Men in dark suits with the particular awareness of professionals moved through the lobby. A woman in a tailored black dress consulted a list, her eyes sharp and practiced. "Name, please," the woman said, looking up from her tablet. Gianna's heart hammered, but her voice remained steady. "Gianna De Rossi, +1. The +1 was a fiction, a man she had hired from a discreet agency, someone who understood how to move through these spaces. He was already inside waiting. The woman's eyes flickered just for a moment, with something that might have been recognition. She checked her list. "Welcome, Ms. DeRossi. Elevator to your left. Penthouse level." The elevator rose silently through the building, climbing toward the sky. Jana watched the city drop away beneath her, the rain-soaked streets becoming smaller and smaller until they looked like something from a dream. She pressed her hands together to stop their shaking. This was really happening. She was really doing this. The elevator doors opened directly into the penthouse and the world stopped. The ballroom was a cathedral of light and shadow, crystal chandeliers casting prismatic illumination across 3,000 square feet of marble and silk. The windows stretched from floor to ceiling on 3 sides, offering views of Manhattan that seemed to encompass the entire world. The city glittered below like a kingdom of diamonds, indifferent and eternal. There were perhaps 200 people in the room, the kind of people whose names appeared in financial reports and society columns, whose decisions moved markets and shaped policy. They moved through the space with the particular confidence of those accustomed to power. The men in immaculate suits, the women in gowns that cost more than most people earned in a year. But as Gianna stepped into the room, something shifted. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but she felt it like a change in atmospheric pressure. Conversations didn't stop. No one turned to stare. These people were too sophisticated, too practiced in the art of discretion. But something in the room's energy transformed. It was as if every person present had developed a sudden awareness of her, even those with their backs turned, even those in conversation across the room. She felt the weight of it. Not judgment, not quite, but recognition. The recognition of something rare and unexpected entering their carefully curated space. Gianna moved forward with the deliberate grace she had spent weeks perfecting. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server. She paused to examine a painting on the wall, a Monet she noted with professional appreciation. She did everything she had planned to do, the performance of a woman entirely at ease. But beneath the performance, her eyes were searching, looking for a face she had only seen in photographs, looking for Carlo Benedetti. And then she felt it, the moment when the room's attention crystallized, not scattered, not diffuse, but focused, concentrated, like the beam of a spotlight that had found its target. She didn't need to turn to know where it was coming from. She felt it the way prey feels the gaze of a predator, as an instinctive recognition of danger and intensity. At the center of the room, near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, stood a man, Vittorio Morelli. She knew this without being told. It was evident in how the space around him seemed to arrange itself according to some invisible geometry of power. People gravitated toward him and away from him simultaneously, maintaining a distance that was both respectful and cautious. He was speaking with a senator, one of the most powerful men in New York, yet the senator seemed diminished in his presence, like a supporting actor in a play where he had assumed he was the lead. Vittorio Morelli was tall, perhaps 6'2", with a kind of physical presence that suggested someone accustomed to taking up space. His suit was perfectly cut, navy blue with a white shirt and a silk tie the color of blood. His hair was dark, swept back from a face that was all sharp angles and careful control. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and they possessed an intelligence that seemed to catalog and calculate everything they encountered. But it was his hands that drew Gianna's attention. They were beautiful in an unexpected way, long-fingered, elegant, with the kind of grace usually reserved for musicians or surgeons. Yet these hands, she knew, had presumably overseen operations that most people couldn't imagine. These hands had signed orders and sealed fates. For perhaps 30 seconds, everything remained as it was. Vittorio continued his conversation with the senator. Gianna continued her performance, studying the artwork, sipping her champagne, moving through the room with practiced ease. And then he turned. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. He didn't suddenly look up or move with theatrical precision. He simply turned his head as if responding to some internal signal, and his gaze swept across the room. It was a casual gesture, the kind of thing a host might do to assess their gathering. But when his eyes found Gianna, that gaze stopped. For a moment that seemed to stretch and expand, they looked at each other across the span of the ballroom, across the champagne flutes and the murmured conversations, across the geography of power and position that filled the space between them. She saw his eyes widen, infinitesimally, She saw something cross his face. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition of a kind she didn't understand. She saw him turn slightly, as if to look away, and then turn back, as if compelled by something beyond his conscious control. The senator continued speaking, unaware that he had lost his audience entirely. Vittorio's attention had been commandeered by something else, something that had appeared in his domain like a crack in carefully maintained glass. Gianna felt her heart accelerate. This wasn't part of the plan. The plan had been to move through the party unnoticed, to find Carlo Benedetti, to have a private conversation, to say the things she had been storing for years. The plan had been to remain invisible, to be a ghost in the machine, to accomplish her purpose and disappear. She hadn't anticipated this. She hadn't prepared for the attention of Vittorio Morelli. More than that, she hadn't prepared for what she felt when he looked at her. It was something sharp and unexpected, like touching a live wire. It was attraction, yes, but it was something more than that. It was a strange sense of recognition, as if two people who had been searching for each other in the dark had suddenly found themselves face to face. But that was impossible. They had never met. They inhabited completely different worlds. There was no reason for recognition to exist between them. Yet there it was, unmistakable and undeniable. Gianna forced herself to turn away. She moved toward the windows, drawn by their vastness, by the view of the city that seemed to offer escape. She stood there, looking out at Manhattan's glittering expanse, acutely aware that she had just made a terrible mistake. She had allowed herself to be noticed. She had allowed the most powerful man in the room to direct his attention toward her. She hadn't anticipated how that would feel, how it would make her feel exposed and vulnerable in a way she hadn't experienced in years. Behind her, she could sense movement. Conversations were being concluded. The senator was being politely excused. Something was shifting, some invisible machinery was being set in motion. Gianna's hands gripped the edge of the window frame. She forced herself to breathe slowly, deliberately. She was still in control. Whatever this was, she could navigate it. She could manage it. Good evening. The voice came from directly behind her, close enough that she could almost feel the warmth of him. It was a voice that carried authority the way some people carry wealth, as something so fundamental to their being that it required no emphasis or explanation. It was a voice that was accustomed to being obeyed, yet it carried no edge of demand, simply certainty. Gianna turned slowly, composing her face into an expression of polite interest. Up close, Vittorio Morelli was even more striking than he had been from across the room. His eyes were the color she had thought, storm gray, but there were depths in them that suggested experiences she couldn't begin to fathom. "Good evening," she replied, her voice steady despite the way her pulse had begun to accelerate. A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth. "I realize I've been remiss. I haven't seen you at one of these events before, and in my experience, that's the kind of oversight I would remember." It was a smooth opener, the kind of thing a practiced charmer might deploy. Yet there was something in his delivery that suggested authenticity. He wasn't performing. He was simply stating an observation. "I don't come to many events like this," Gianna replied carefully. "I prefer to stay out of the spotlight. An unusual preference for someone who commands this much attention simply by entering a room." There it was, acknowledgement of what they both knew to be true. She hadn't been invisible tonight, she had been noticed. She was being noticed. "I think you may be exaggerating," Gianna said, turning back to the window, hoping the gesture would discourage further conversation. Behind her, she felt him move slightly closer, not threateningly, but with the confidence of someone for whom proximity was his right. "You're new to New York," he said. It wasn't a question. "I've been here for several years, actually. But new to my world," he continued, undeterred. "That much is obvious." Gianna turned to face him again. "And what makes you so certain of that?" His eyes held hers with an intensity that was almost overwhelming. "Because I know everyone in my world. And you, I don't know." The weight of his gaze was almost physical. She felt seen in a way she hadn't felt seen in years, not as the invisible woman she had worked so carefully to become, but as something else entirely, something that mattered, something that had weight and consequence. "Perhaps I prefer to remain unknown," she said softly. "Perhaps," he agreed. "But I find that the most interesting people are always the ones with the most interesting reasons for their secrecy." He extended his hand. "Vittorio Morelli." Gianna looked at his hand, at those beautiful, dangerous hands, and knew that taking it would be a decision, with consequences she couldn't yet see. Taking his hand would acknowledge something, agree to something, open a door that might be difficult to close. But she had come here to face difficult things. She had come here to look into the eyes of the past and reclaim her power. And so she took his hand. His grip was firm but not aggressive, warm and steady. When he released her hand, she felt the absence of contact like a loss. "Gianna De Rossi," she said, giving her real name. It was a risk, but somehow anything else felt like a lie he would see through immediately. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps. Or the beginning of understanding that the woman before him was connected to something, to some history, to some version of the world that had meaning beyond this moment. De Rossi, he repeated softly. An old name, an Italian name. "Yes," she confirmed. "And yet you're here in New York." "Circumstances change," she said carefully. "People adapt." He nodded slowly as if he understood far more than she had said. "That they do. And sometimes when people adapt, they build themselves into versions of themselves that are stronger than they were before. I'm curious which version you are, Gianna De Rossi. The person you were before or the person you've become?" It was a penetrating question, one that suggested he understood that she was hiding something, that there was a before and an after to her life. She didn't answer immediately. "Dinner," he said suddenly. "There's an excellent restaurant a few blocks from here. Not the kind of place you'll find reviewed in magazines, the kind of place I know." "That's very kind, but—" "Tomorrow night," he continued as if she hadn't spoken. "I'd like to know the story of Gianna De Rossi. Not the polished version you show the world, but the real one. The one that brought you to New York. The one that brought you to my party." Before she could respond, he inclined his head slightly. It was a gesture of dismissal and departure, delivered with such grace that it took her a moment to realize he was leaving. "Tomorrow," he said. "I'll have someone bring you the details." And then he was gone, moving back into the crowd, resuming his conversations as if the brief interruption had never occurred. But Gianna stood rooted to the spot, her hand still warm from his touch, her mind racing with the implications of what had just happened. She had come here to find the past. Instead, she had encountered something entirely unexpected, and as she looked out at the glittering city beyond the window, she wondered if she had just made the most dangerous decision of her life. The envelope arrived at her office the next morning, delivered by a courier who said nothing and waited for no signature. Inside was an address written in precise, careful handwriting, the kind of handwriting that suggested someone accustomed to having their words followed exactly. The address was in Greenwich Village at a restaurant called Cielo, the Italian word for sky. Gianna spent the entire day in a state of controlled anxiety. She told herself she could refuse. She could throw the envelope away and disappear back into the obscurity she had so carefully constructed. That would be the intelligent thing to do, the safe thing, the thing that someone with genuine self-preservation instincts would choose. But she didn't throw it away. By 6 o'clock that evening, she found herself in her apartment standing before her closet, trying to decide what one wore to dinner with a Mafia boss, something that suggested sophistication but not intention, something that conveyed confidence without desperation, something that would protect her somehow against the strange intensity of his gaze. She chose a black dress, elegant, understated, the kind of dress that worked equally well for board meetings or funerals. She wore her mother's pearl necklace, a small rebellion against everything she had tried to leave behind. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a woman she didn't quite recognize. The restaurant was hidden on a side street in Greenwich Village, so discreet that its existence seemed almost accidental. There was no sign outside, no indication that it was anything other than a brownstone. But when she gave her name to the woman who answered the door, she was led through a narrow hallway into a space that seemed to exist outside of time and the ordinary world. The restaurant was small, perhaps 8 tables, and lit by candlelight that transformed everything into something warm and intimate. The walls were exposed brick, decorated with photographs that appeared to be decades old. The air smelled of rosemary and garlic and something else she couldn't quite identify. Each table was set with linens that had been pressed to perfection, with silverware that caught the candlelight, with glasses that promised either wine or poison. Vittoria was already there, seated at a corner table that offered views of the entire room. He was watching the entrance as if he had been expecting her, though she was exactly on time. He stood as she approached, a gesture of old-world courtesy that seemed both performative and genuine. "Gianna," he said, speaking her name as if it meant something specific, something with weight. You came. You were rather persuasive, she replied, taking the seat he offered. A woman arrived immediately with wine, a Barolo that was rich and complex and seemed to have cost more money than Gianna had ever spent on a single bottle. They ordered without consulting menus. The food that emerged was simple but extraordinary. Pasta handmade that morning, risotto infused with saffron, fish so fresh it seemed to carry the taste of the sea. But the food was secondary to the conversation. Vittorio asked her questions, each one carefully constructed, each one designed to reveal something without appearing intrusive. He wanted to know about her work in the art world, how she had come to develop such refined taste, what drew her to New York specifically. Each answer she gave seemed to lead to another question, another layer of excavation. He was, she realized, trying to understand who she was without asking directly. He was constructing a portrait of her from the fragments she was willing to share. "You're avoiding something," he said finally as they approached dessert. "There's a specific question you're waiting for me to ask. The question about who you are beyond the professionally polished version." Gianna set down her fork carefully. The moment she had been dreading and anticipating had arrived. "Is there?" she asked carefully. "There is," he confirmed. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with those storm-gray eyes. "You gave a false name at my party. Not false exactly, but incomplete. Girassi isn't a name that appears in society anymore. It disappeared about a decade ago. There was a scandal, I think. Something in Rome. Something that erased an entire family from the world they inhabited. He was testing her. He already knew who she was, or at least significant parts of it. The question was whether she would confirm it. "How do you know that?" she asked quietly. "I make it my business to know things," he replied simply. "Particularly things about interesting women who appear at my parties looking like they're on the verge of either murdering someone or saving their own life." Despite everything, Gianna felt something that might have been laughter trying to escape her throat. "That's oddly perceptive. I'm not in the business of being imprecise," he said. "So let me ask directly, since we seem to have moved beyond dancing around the subject. Who are you, really? Not the woman in the black dress at my party. Not the art consultant with the careful smile. Who are you when no one is watching?" The question hung between them, weighted with significance. Gianna could feel her heart accelerating. This was the moment where she could lie or tell the truth. This was the moment where everything either continued as it had been, or transformed into something entirely different. She took a breath and began to speak. She told him about her father, about who he had been, about the empire he had built, about the trust that had been placed in him by people who trafficked in the spaces between legality and shadow. She told him about the accusations, about the witness who testified against him, about a man named Carlo Benedetti who had been her father's closest associate and had chosen betrayal over loyalty. She told him about her mother, who had died of a broken heart. She told him about her father following 3 years later, his will to live extinguished by the weight of shame and loss. She told him about the years of anonymity, of building herself into someone no one would recognize, of existing in the margins while the life she had been born to was lived by everyone but her. She told him about the invitation to his party, about how she had orchestrated her presence there, about how her plan had been to find Carlo Benedetti and face him with the truth of what his betrayal had cost. When she finished, there was silence. Vittorio sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable. Outside the restaurant, Greenwich Village continued its evening rhythms, oblivious to the conversation taking place in this small, intimate space. "And did you find him?" Vittorio asked finally. "Carlo Benedetti. Did you confront him?" "No," Gianna said. "I was, distracted. Before I could find him, you introduced yourself. And then the evening ended, and I went home, and I didn't sleep. And I spent all day trying to figure out why I'm here right now, having dinner with you instead of accomplishing what I came for." Vittorio rose from his chair and moved to the window. He stood there, looking out at the street, his profile lit by the candlelight and the ambient glow of the city beyond. "Do you know what Carlo Benedetti did after he testified against your father?" he asked quietly. "No," Gianna said. "I never learned the details. He simply disappeared from Rome. I assumed he went into hiding, or perhaps left the country." "He did leave the country," Vittorio confirmed. "He came to New York, and he immediately tried to become the kind of man who could operate in my world." He turned back to face her, and there was something in his expression that suggested he was about to tell her something significant. "He was competent," Vittorio continued. "Intelligent enough, cautious enough to survive for a while. But he made a critical mistake. He became greedy. He decided that he could skim from operations that didn't belong to him. He thought that the distance between Rome and New York, between your father's world and mine, meant that no one would notice. Gianna felt her stomach tighten. What happened to him? What always happens to people who betray trust? Vittorio said simply. Eventually, they answer for it. He returned to his seat. 3 years ago, Carlo Benedetti disappeared. His body was never found. But I'm telling you that he paid the price for what he did to your family. I'm telling you that even in this world, especially in this world, there is a reckoning. There is justice, even if it's not the kind that appears in courts of law. Gianna wasn't sure how to process this information. She had come to New York for closure, but she had imagined that closure would come from confronting Carlo Benedetti herself, from making him understand the weight of what he had done. Instead, the universe had apparently taken the matter out of her hands. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked quietly. Vittorio was silent for a long moment. "Because I want you to understand something," he said finally. "I want you to understand that in this world we take care of our own. And I want you to understand that when something, or someone, comes into my orbit and captures my attention the way you have, I investigate, thoroughly. I learn who they are, where they come from, what matters to them. I do this not out of cruelty but out of necessity. In my world, trust is the most dangerous currency. It costs more than money. It costs more than power. It costs lives." He leaned forward slightly. "I have verified who you are, Gianna De Rossi. I have confirmed your story. And I have looked at the evidence and I have concluded that you are exactly what you appear to be. A woman who was destroyed by someone else's betrayal, who rebuilt herself from nothing, who carries scars that have made her beautiful in a way that most people never understand. And what do you want from me?" she asked. The corner of his mouth lifted in something that might have been a smile. "That's the interesting question, isn't it? Because I'm still trying to figure that out. I don't do relationships, Gianna. I don't do connections that aren't strategic or advantageous. I don't do anything that compromises my focus or my control. And yet, here you are. Here we are. And I find that I want to know more." He reached across the table and his hand found hers. His touch was warm and steady, and it sent a cascade of sensation through her nervous system. "So what I want," he continued softly, "is for you to give me the chance to know you, not as a project or an acquisition, but as someone I'm genuinely interested in understanding." Gianna looked at his hand on hers, at the candlelight catching in his eyes, at the dangerous beauty of the man sitting across from her. Everything in her insisted that this was a terrible idea. Everything in her recognized that what he was offering was not protection, but a different kind of risk. The risk of being truly seen, truly known, by someone who operated in a world where knowledge was power. But she also recognized that she hadn't survived years of anonymity and reconstruction in order to spend the rest of her life hiding. She hadn't endured the weight of her family's shame in order to never trust again. "Okay," she said finally. "Yes, I want that too." 3 months passed, like chapters in a book written in a language she was learning as she read it. Vittorio took her places that existed between worlds. Rooftop gardens overlooking the city where no one else was permitted. Private rooms in restaurants where the chef cooked specifically for them. Galleries after hours where they wandered through collections of art that were for sale to the highest bidder. He introduced her to his world carefully, gradually, revealing layers of himself that most people never glimpsed. But with each revelation came the increasing weight of what she was becoming entangled in. She attended dinners where the men who were his associates looked at her with interest that bordered on predatory curiosity. She received phone calls from law enforcement officials asking oblique questions about her relationship to Vittorio Morelli. She began to understand that being close to him meant being permanently marked by that proximity, that their connection was visible to everyone who needed to know what it meant. He told her stories about his rise, about how he had inherited his world from his father and had spent the intervening years consolidating power, building alliances, eliminating threats. He told her about the choices he had made that were irrevocable, the lines he had crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. He told her, in other words, the truth about who he was. And despite that truth, or perhaps because of it, she found herself falling in love with him. It was a love that existed in the spaces between reality and illusion, that existed as a kind of beautiful, terrible truth that they both understood, but neither articulated directly. They moved through the world as though they were simply two people who enjoyed each other's company, while the reality underneath was something far more profound and dangerous. It was Vittorio who first suggested that she move in with him, not phrased as a question but as a logical extension of what was already happening between them. His penthouse became her residence, her address, her anchor point in the city. She continued her work as an art consultant, but increasingly, she found herself drawn into his world, advising him on acquisitions, helping him understand pieces that came across his desk, serving as a kind of aesthetic conscience to his operations. She also began to understand the limitations of what he was willing to share. There were conversations that would end abruptly when she entered the room. There were phone calls he would take privately, behind closed doors, his voice too quiet for her to make out words. There was a part of his life that remained fundamentally separated from her, sealed off by necessity and protocol. And then, 4 months into their relationship, everything changed. She was in the apartment alone when the men arrived. There were 3 of them, moving with the efficiency of professionals, not ransacking but searching with purpose. They were looking for something specific, and though she tried to stop them, they were polite but firm in their dismissal of her objections. Gianna called Vittorio's number 3 times before he answered. When he did, his voice carried an edge of something she had never heard before. Fear, perhaps, or something close to it. "Don't move," he commanded. "Don't speak to them. Don't answer any questions. I'm sending someone to get you." But the men were already placing her in handcuffs. Not roughly, but with the certainty of people following established protocol. Within 10 minutes, she was in the back of a federal agent's car, being transported to the federal building downtown. What followed was a 17-hour interrogation that tested everything she thought she understood about herself and about Vittorio. The agents wanted to know what she knew about his operations. They wanted her to testify about the phone calls she had overheard, the conversations she had witnessed, the meetings that had taken place in her presence. They wanted her to be a window into a world that had been largely sealed off from law enforcement scrutiny. And they wanted her to understand that she had a choice, cooperation or complicity. There was no neutral ground in a federal investigation. Gianna sat in an interrogation room painted institutional gray and understood for the first time that she was caught in something she couldn't simply walk away from. The love she had been constructing with Vittorio had a price, and that price was now being demanded. She thought about her father, about the betrayal that had destroyed him. She thought about Carlo Benedetti and the reckoning that had supposedly come for him. She thought about Vittorio's hands on hers across that candlelit table, about the truth in his eyes when he looked at her. And in that moment, she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She looked at the federal agents across the table and told them no. No, she wouldn't testify. No, she wouldn't cooperate. No, she wouldn't become the instrument of his destruction in exchange for immunity or protection or anything else they could offer. She wouldn't be like Carlo Benedetti. She wouldn't be the person who betrayed the one she loved in order to save herself. The agents had threatened her with charges, conspiracy, money laundering, a dozen felonies that could put her away for decades. But Gianna had learned something in all the years of rebuilding herself. She had learned that fear is only as powerful as the things you fear losing. And she had already lost everything once. She couldn't lose it again. They released her 19 hours after they had arrested her. She walked out of the federal building into a Manhattan evening, uncertain where to go or what would happen next. The penthouse wouldn't be safe. The agents had made it clear that they had warrants, that they would be watching. Everything that mattered was trapped inside walls that were now sealed off from her. She stood on the street in the gathering darkness, and she was alone again, the way she had been before Vittorio had looked at her across a ballroom and asked, "Who is that woman?" The phone in her pocket vibrated. A text, from an unknown number. "Go to the corner of Christopher and West. Walk 3 blocks north. There will be a car waiting." Gianna walked through Greenwich Village in the evening darkness, not knowing if she was walking toward salvation or something else entirely. The car was where it was supposed to be, a nondescript sedan with tinted windows. The driver didn't speak, simply gestured for her to get in. She was driven to an apartment building she didn't recognize in a neighborhood she didn't know, escorted to a unit on the 12th floor. And there, sitting by a window overlooking the city lights, was Vittorio. He looked diminished somehow, older, as if something fundamental had been taken from him. But when he saw her, something like relief crossed his face. "You didn't talk to them," he said. It wasn't a question. Somehow he knew. "No," she confirmed. "Do you understand what that means? Do you understand what it cost you?" I understand, she said softly. They wanted me to testify. They wanted me to help them build a case against you. They offered me immunity, protection, a new life, and I said no. Vittorio rose and crossed the room. He took her face in his hands, and for a moment, he simply looked at her as if he was trying to memorize the specific arrangement of her features. Why? He asked. Because I've already been the person who betrayed someone I loved, she said. Not directly, but by proximity, by allowing betrayal to happen while I remain silent. And I won't be that person again. I won't betray you even if it costs me everything. He kissed her then, and it was the kind of kiss that contained in it an entire lifetime of understanding, that they were bound to each other now by something deeper than simple attraction or affection. They were bound by choice, by the conscious decision to remain loyal even when loyalty was costly. There's something you need to know, Vittorio said when they separated. Something I haven't told you. He led her to a desk where files were spread out, documents and photographs arranged with precision. The documents were old, dated from the years before her family's fall, and in them she found the answer to a question she had thought was already answered. Carlo Benedetti had not betrayed her father alone. There had been a second conspirator, someone closer, someone trusted, someone whose name had been protected in exchange for cooperation. And as she read through the documents, as she saw the signature on the affidavit, as she understood the full scope of what had happened, Gianna realized that the past she thought she had already processed still held surprises, still held secrets. But in that moment, standing in that apartment with Vittorio, understanding the depth of his loyalty, understanding what he had done to protect her from that truth, she recognized something else. She recognized that some things were better left unexamined. Some truths were too destructive to process. Some stories were better told in the dark, whispered between two people who had chosen each other despite everything. And so Gianna De Rossi, who had come to a party seeking closure, who had walked into a ballroom through whispers and stares, who had captured the attention of the most powerful man in the room, found something she had never anticipated finding. She found a home, not in a place but in a person, in the particular, dangerous grace of a man who had seen her and recognized something that needed saving. She found home in the choice to remain loyal, even when betrayal would have been easier. She found home in the knowledge that someone had chosen her, not despite her history but because of it, because her history had made her strong enough to survive the complexity of loving him. Outside the apartment, the city glittered with its particular indifference to human dramas and stories. Millions of people moved through its streets, each carrying their own narratives of loss and reconstruction, of betrayal and recovery, of the strange grace that comes from choosing to believe in something, despite all evidence that belief is dangerous. And in that apartment, two people stood together at the window, watching the city lights, understanding that the moment of beginning, that moment when she walked into the party through whispers and stares, had actually been the moment of ending something, and the beginning of something she was still learning to name. The story doesn't resolve into simple happiness. The story doesn't deliver them to a place where everything is safe or certain or without risk, but it delivers them to a place of conscious choice, of understanding, of the particular beauty that exists when two wounded people decide to stop running and instead stand still, together, in the knowledge that some kinds of love are worth all the danger they carry with them.